All right, folks. First off, thank you so much for coming. My name is Brandon Carter. I'm the chairman of the Education Committee of the Tredegar Society. Again, thanks for coming out tonight. Really looking forward to what we have in store. Before we get into the talk itself, I want to make a couple announcements. First off, I want to thank a couple groups. I want to thank Hunton & Williams, the Richmond law firm. Hunton has graciously decided to pour some money our way so that we can host these things and have wonderful speakers like Jimmy come and talk to us. And this is not Hunton's first year doing this, so we thank Hunton & Williams for their support. Also tonight we thank the Hill-Tucker Bar Association for their support and their co-sponsorship this evening, and we welcome all the members of the Hill-Tucker Bar Association here with us tonight. Our speaker, of course, is Mr. Jimmy Price, and we're going to hear about the Battle of Newmarket Heights and the role of the USCTs in that battle tonight. Jimmy is a museum curator with the U.S. Army Center of Military History, where he's working on the upcoming National Museum of the United States Army, which is scheduled to open in 2019. He received his Master's in Military History from Norwich in 2009. His first book, The Battle of Newmarket Heights, Freedom Will Be Theirs by the Sword, was nominated in the nonfiction category for the 15th Annual Library of Virginia Literary Awards. The Journal of Southern History claims this slim volume offers considerable insight regarding the black military experience. His second book, The Battle of First Deep Bottom, was released to critical acclaim in 2014. Jimmy writes about different aspects of the Civil War on his blog, Freedom by the Sword, a historian's journey through the American Civil War era, that's contributed essays to a companion to the Musée Argonne Campaign and Hallowed Ground magazine. He lives in Fredericksburg, Virginia with his wife and 3 children. So without further ado, we welcome Jimmy Price.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a Thursday evening. I assure you I'm much less impressive than that introduction. No. Oh, I killed the AV just by being here. I have destroyed the PowerPoint. Let me see if this does something. Aha, okay, we're good. Well, as I said, thanks for coming out on a Thursday evening in Richmond. It's good to be back here. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure to meet in person, I grew up in Richmond. I guess I can admit this now because it's cool, but I was a Southsider. Yeah, so back when I moved here in the mid-'80s, that was not exactly the best thing, and anybody who lived in Henrico was very snotty about the difference between West Enders and Southsiders. So to all my South Side friends. I interned with Richmond National Battlefield here at this building and at Cold Harbor way back in 2000, back as I was telling Brandon earlier when Mike Gorman was a seasonal, just to give you an idea of how long ago that was. And I also worked next door at Tredegar when it first opened. So it's good to be home, and it's good to be talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. I try to be objective when it comes to the Battle of Newmarket Heights, but if you've read my book or my blog, you know I'm pretty excited about it, and I'm pretty passionate about it. And with this being African American History Month, it's a very good time to examine the battle, its symbolism, its significance, and the guys who were the rock stars of the show, the U.S. colored troops, who were the tip of the spear in the attack and successfully took Newmarket Heights. I try to tell this story in the words of the participants, and just to give you some warning ahead of time, there's going to be some really rough language. I apologize for that in advance, but I think in order to fully grapple with the issues that were in play in 1864 during this battle, it helps to hear it warts and all. So there's going to be some stuff that might make you a little uncomfortable. That's okay. We'll get through it. And if anything else, if you start nodding off, you'll probably perk up at some of these quotes that I'm going to be reading. Stuff you can't make up, and blistering stuff that will make the paint peel off the walls. But we'll get to that in a minute. So is everybody familiar with the Battle of Newmarket Heights? Roughly, sort of. This is not the Battle of Newmarket. There are no lost shoes in this battle. If you talk about the Shenandoah Valley, at all, I will probably get angry at you. This is New Market Heights, which is part of a larger battle called the Battle of Chaffins Farm. If you've ever been to Richmond battlefields, great park over at Fort Harrison and Fort Gilmer and all those forts that connect. That's part of this same battle. It's a two-pronged assault upon the very gates of Richmond by a lesser-known army in the Union, the Army of the James. There's been one scholarly work written on the Army of the James, and it's called Army of Amateurs. So, yeah. And my great-great-grandfather was in the Army of the James, so somebody please write a better book on the Army of the James. What this is part of Grant's 5th offensive against the defenses of Richmond and Petersburg. So this is during the Richmond-Petersburg campaign, 9 months, starting in June of 1864 and lasting all the way until the first week of April in 1865. When Petersburg falls, Richmond falls, and Appomattox follows 1 week later. So this is a very important time during the American Civil War, when the fighting was extremely intense and casualties were extreme. Sort of some context as to how the armies get here in the first place. In March of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant is brought from the Western Theater to take command of all Union armies. He's going to make his headquarters with the Federal Army of the Potomac, and he's going to put all Union armies in motion in May of 1864 in a concerted effort, not necessarily to capture Richmond, but to destroy the Confederacy's army and the Confederacy's infrastructure, and that's going to be the Overland Campaign, which is what you see depicted in this map here. So it's going to start up where I live in Spotsylvania County. The Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, the North Anna, and someplace that you probably know very well, Cold Harbor, is going to be brutal fighting, constant combat. The armies up to this point in the war, sort of the tradition in the East was to have one big battle and then everybody kind of go home and lick their wounds for a little while before the next campaign began. That's not the case with Grant. He's pressing in with bulldog tenacity, and he's not letting Lee and his vaunted Army of Northern Virginia rest and recoup. He keeps the pressure on because he knows that he has the numerical and logistical advantage. So there's going to be constant combat all through the month of May, culminating with the Battle of Cold Harbor, where Grant is stymied in his attempt to take Richmond from the north. So he will sidestep Richmond and go for the next best thing, the vital supply hub of Petersburg to the south. And his armies will arrive there in mid-June of 1864. Obviously, it was not his intention to have a siege there. He wanted to quickly take the city and then threaten Richmond from the south. But events didn't quite work out that way. And because, for a number of reasons, the Union commanders tasked with taking the city of Petersburg were either incompetent, they were exhausted, their men were exhausted, all of the above. And it turns into a siege. And what Grant is going to do in order to try to break the siege, and once the army's entrenched, there's this series of fortifications you see there around the city of Richmond, and then there's another interconnected series of fortifications around Petersburg. If you see Deep Bottom there, and I'm going to try to use okay. Deep Bottom's kind of right there in the middle of the map. Deep Bottom is now a park operated by Henrico County, the boat landing. But it was a vital part of Grant's master plan for taking Richmond and Petersburg in 1864. Starting in late June, he has the Army of the James establish a bridgehead there. And what that's going to do, once the engineers construct a pontoon bridge, that's going to allow him to shift troops across to the north side of the James and threaten the city of Richmond, while he is also simultaneously threatening the city of Petersburg with the Army of the Potomac. So the advantage of having two armies in play here, the Army of the James has been in that little area of land in between Richmond and Petersburg known as Bermuda 100. They had been there since May, so he has that army that he can rely upon to slip across the river and threaten Richmond, while the Army of the Potomac is going to be tasked with cutting off the railroads and the supply roads leading into the city of Petersburg. So this is Grant's sort of master plan that is going to get underway in July of 1864 with the First Battle of Deep Bottom. Great book about that just came out not too long ago. And this is the counterpart to the Battle of the Crater. Most people are familiar with the Crater. We'll talk about that a little bit in terms of how it relates to U.S. colored troops. But most people don't know that there was an entire large body of Union troops that were shifted across at Deep Bottom to threaten Richmond at the same time, and that they were very successful in siphoning off Confederate troops to the north side of the James. So much so that when the mine exploded on the morning of July 30th, 1864, you have 6 divisions of Lee's army north of the James, and as Edward Porter Alexander put it, sucking their thumbs while the Battle of the Crater got underway. You can't have a first Battle of Deep Bottom without a second, so in August of 1864, Grant is going to try the same strategy again. Obviously, the first attempt did not work out, and the army retreated back across the bridgehead at Deep Bottom. In August, they're going to try it again. Once again, not terribly successful. So by September of 1864, Grant is kicking around several different options. He's playing with the idea of maybe going down to Wilmington, North Carolina, and cutting off that vital supply hub. Most of the supplies that are still coming in to Petersburg are coming in from that one port city. So he's thinking maybe of nipping it in the bud right at the source. He's also shifting troops to the Shenandoah Valley over the summer, and also, Phil Sheridan's troops are going to go there in late 1864 as well. So there's a lot of pieces in play on the chessboard of war. But he finally decides upon another attempt north of the James, and this is going to be what will become the Battle of Chaffins Farm. So to give you a little bit about how this plan develops, the Army of the James is commanded by a very colorful and famous, or possibly infamous, character in the American Civil War by the name of Benjamin Franklin Butler, the Beast of New Orleans. I'll show you his picture in a little while. You'll probably recognize it. I don't know if they still have it, but when I worked next door, they had a chamber pot with his image emblazoned on the bottom. Still have it? Okay, cool. Well, go see that. And a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, that object is worth 1,000 words. Butler is a very interesting guy. He's a politician. He's a political general. He gets involved with the Union war effort from the very start. And he's of course doing this for political clout. But he's also a devoted patriot. So he's a very interesting guy, a very infamous guy. And one of his other nicknames was Spoons, for his penchant to pilfer from rich Southerners. So a man who definitely went up to the line and possibly crossed it on a few occasions in terms of corruption. But he's a very powerful political Republican that Lincoln can't afford to make angry. So he's given command of the Army of the James. He will come up with a plan for a 2-pronged attack against the city of Richmond, which you can see the plan of attack shown in this map here. This is Mike Gorman who did this map. The idea is the 18th Corps will cross at Aiken's Landing, and they will go up against the defenses of Richmond, which is where Fort Harrison, Fort Gilmer, all of those lovely national parks are preserved. And the 10th Corps, under David Bell Birney, will cross at Deep Bottom and threaten New Market Heights. New Market Heights was important because the New Market Road, which is modern-day Route 5, if you ever travel out in Varina, is a direct link into the city of Richmond. The cavalry is supposed to charge across the deep bottom bridgehead after the infantry, and the idea is a simultaneous push against the Confederate defenses. Once the Newmarket defenses have fallen, the 10th Corps will link up with the 18th Corps and march into the city of Richmond. That's the idea. Doesn't quite work out that way. So Butler will come up with his orders. He's going to meet briefly at a place called Point of Rocks in Chesterfield County with his subordinate commanders, and he will explain his orders in detail. He will issue a 16-page battle order to his subordinates explaining what he wants done, and then the plan is set in motion. There's a photograph of Deep Bottom. So that's one of the bridges that's going to be utilized by the U.S. colored troops when they make their attack on Newmarket Heights. Order of battle. So there's Ben Butler in all of his glory. If you read my book, my favorite quote is that he resembled a dissipated toad. And you can't get a good read on this guy. You know, it's either you love him or you hate him. All the biographies written on him that I've read or found, you know, it's Ben Butler, the South called him Beast, or Ben Butler, the damnedest Yankee. So obviously he knew how to win friends and influence people. His subordinate commanders, and these are the troops that are going to be going up against Newmarket Heights. It's going to be Charles Payne's division. A little bit about them and what Butler is thinking here. In May of 1863, the Adjutant General's Office of the U.S. War Department is going to establish the Bureau of Colored Troops for organizing and equipping black infantry, artillery, and cavalry regiments. This is a provision that's in the Emancipation Proclamation to bring African American soldiers into the Union Army. There's several regiments that formed sort of unofficially, had state designations, and were used prior to this in 1862 out in Missouri and several other places. But the official effort began in 1863. And all told, just under 200,000 black soldiers will serve during the Civil War. 37,000 of that number will die, a very high casualty rate. And in the East, the two main armies, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, will both have U.S. colored troops joining their ranks just as the Overland Campaign and the Bermuda Hundred Campaign, those campaigns are kicking off. So they're fresh troops, they're big regiment. You know, regiments on paper are supposed to be 1,000 men, but most of these white troops that have been fighting for a long time kind of scoff at that notion. Regiments are numbering 200 to 300 men after all the heavy fighting. These huge regiments start arriving, 1,000 men strong, of U.S. colored troops, many of which were former slaves who had escaped to Union lines, wanted to join the Union war effort for obvious reasons, fighting for freedom for themselves and for their loved ones back home. And then there's a smaller proportion of them that are freedmen from the North, and they're fighting to prove that they're worthy of the benefits of full citizenship. So obviously, I mean, if you know the history of the American Civil War, if anybody has a vested interest in the outcome, it is the United States colored troops. The South, the Confederacy, did not they did not take it lightly that the Union Army resorted to arming blacks to fight them. They viewed this as inciting servile insurrection. So they will view the U.S. colored troops more or less as a massive slave uprising. Nat Turner and John Brown on a massive scale. Their worst nightmares from the antebellum days come true. So in order to discourage African Americans from joining those ranks, they will treat black soldiers very roughly. In some instances, well, many instances, well-known instances at places like the Crater, Fort Pillow, and as we'll see, Newmarket Heights, black soldiers in the act of surrendering will be murdered, shot down in cold blood. It was also the policy of the Confederate government to execute white officers because they're the abolitionists who are inciting this servile insurrection. So it didn't always work out that way. It worked out, the Confederacy is going to try to return former slaves return them to slavery if they're captured on the battlefield. But oftentimes the sight of an African American in uniform will throw Confederate soldiers into a bloodthirsty rage, and instead of taking them prisoner, they will gun them down, club them to death, bayonet them right there on the field of battle. One of the Texans that I'll be talking about in a minute said that attacking us with black troops was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. After incidents like Fort Pillow, which is in April of 1864, the Crater, July of 1864, when black troops are massacred in the act of trying to surrender, the word is going to get out. And any African American soldiers who are going to be involved in any fighting, even working behind the lines, as supply troops, they're liable to be captured, lynched, murdered, you name it. And they know that that's the fate that awaits them. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about these men who are going to make this charge at Newmarket Heights, that they're not necessarily in the same position as a white Union soldier who, if the battle doesn't work out too well, if he's wounded and gets captured by the enemy, more often than not, he'll be treated relatively well. His wounds will be tended to, he'll be taken care of. Not so with the black troops. Butler's army has the largest contingent of African American soldiers serving in the East, the Army of the James, and after the Battle of the Crater, which was a fiasco, a completely botched effort by the Union Army, which heavily involved the U.S. colored troops. After that incident in July of 1864, the fall guy, the easy target to blame for that failure were the black troops. So the reputation of U.S. colored troops took a hit in July of 1864, and Butler writes that when he is formulating his battle plan against Newmarket Heights, that he wants to put all of his black troops in the very front lines to sort of redeem their reputation and prove that they can be good soldiers. So, as you'll see here, these are all USCT, or United States Colored Troops regiments, and the 2nd Brigade under Colonel Alonzo Draper, 3rd Brigade under Colonel Samuel Duncan are going to be the 2 brigades that are most heavily involved in this attack on the Newmarket line. Also, from the 18th Corps, William Birney's Colored Brigade will be detached from the 18th Corps and attached to the 10th Corps, so that all of the black troops, more or less, in the entire Army of the James are involved in this effort against Newmarket Heights. There will also be a small contingent of United States Colored Cavalry. They're going to be serving dismounted, sort of as skirmishers during this battle. Now, who are they facing? Who are the troops defending the Newmarket line? Are these the clerks of Richmond, who are going to be called out at a moment's notice from their, calculating and, note-taking? No, this is what once was the most vaunted regiment or group of regiments in the entire Army of Northern Virginia, Hood's Texas Brigade. They're going to be more or less manning the trenches right where the U.S. colored troops come in their attack. If you know anybody from Texas, this doesn't require much explanation, but the Texas Brigade was known as the hardest fighting unit of the Army of Northern Virginia. They earned their reputation at Gaines's Mill here, right outside of Richmond, June of 1862. And they're involved in most of the battles in the Eastern Theater up to this point, and even one out in the West. They go out to serve in Chickamauga, and they take horrendous, tremendous casualties, but they don't care. So these are some of the best troops in the Army. Lee loved his Texans. He loved these troops. There's a story that right before the campaigns in 1864 kicked off, there was a British observer who was saddled, right next to Robert E. Lee while the Texas Brigade was on review. And the Englishmen couldn't help but notice that all of the Texans had ratty uniforms and the bottoms were blown out of all of their pants. And he was concerned about this because he was British, you know. They're into uniforms and being prim and proper and military. And he couldn't believe that this rabble that was parading before him were the vaunted Texas Brigade. So he mentions it to Lee, and he says, you know, none of these guys have, like, you know, the backs of their pants are all blown out. And Lee just looks at him and says, don't worry, no one ever sees the backs of my Texans. So they're going to be in the New Market line. Martin Gary's dismounted cavalry, which includes the famous Hampton Legion, is going to be manning the trenches. And then there will be, the line is anchored on each end with artillery. Rockbridge artillery, those are the famous Rockbridge artillerymen who fought and made a name for themselves under Stonewall Jackson, whose cannons are out still in front of VMI to this day. And then the Richmond Howitzers, another elite unit of artillery, are going to be anchoring each end of this line that these U.S. colored troops are going to be going up against. Now, they didn't have barbed wire during the Civil War, but they did have something very similar. Obstructions that would be placed out in front of the ditches, or the trenches, that are dug right in front of the New Market line. And in the photograph here, you can see some examples of how the Confederates would have put obstructions out in front of their lines. There were three distinct separate lines of wooden obstructions that were placed out in front of New Market Heights. All the trees were cleared so that there was a clear field of fire, and they would just leave the tree trunks there because it was one more thing that the attacking troops are going to have to climb over. They would also take the tops of the trees and knit them together very much like barbed wire. And then they would also form the stakes that you see there. These are all French terms, abattis, chevaux de frise. U.S. military is obsessed with France and French things in the mid-19th century. But the whole idea behind this is to slow your opponent down and make them literally hack their way through. Some of the guys in the front lines of the attack are going to be what are called pioneer troops. They're not carrying muskets, they're carrying axes, and it's their job to hack through that stuff as quickly as possible and clear it out of the way, because while they're delayed, they're out in the open and they're sitting ducks. And as I said, three separate distinct lines of obstructions out in front of the New Market line. This is a photograph of New Market Heights, which I didn't know existed until about a year and a half ago. You know, the Ohio cavalrymen there wanted to pose for a picture, so everybody's seen this picture who knows, you know, the photographs taken around the Richmond area, but finally someone noticed, hey, that's the battlefield at New Market Heights in the background there. So behind the cavalrymen there, you can see the sloping ground leading up to New Market Heights. Right behind them in that middle area there is where the main fighting is going to take place. So now you have an image to associate with the area. It looks very, very different now if you go out there. So, on the morning of September 29th, the plan is set in motion. Some of the U.S. colored troops that are going to make this attack were able to catch transport boats that were going to take them from Dutch Gap to to the Deep Bottom area. Other troops involved in the Battle of Chaffins Farm are going to have to march all the way from Petersburg to Deep Bottom. And there was a bit of a snafu with the orders that were given out, so that the troops who made the attack didn't have any time to rest. They basically marched all night and had about 10 minutes worth of rest on the evening of September 28th into the 29th, and then they have to get up and fight a battle. So the battle proper is going to kick off right around 5:30 in the morning, when it's nice and dark and cool and a mist enshrouded the field. So you can see they're going to come up from Deep Bottom, which is at the very bottom of the map there. They'll march to the Kingsland Road, where they will deploy, and then this is about 26,000 troops total that are marching here. They will deploy They will spread out in line of battle, and then General Payne, the guy with the saucy-looking mustache there that I showed you earlier, he has all these troops at his disposal, and he will send in 2 regiments, under-strength regiments, less than 1,000 men, to test the defenses, and that is going to be the Brigade of Samuel Duncan. So Duncan's assault is going to kick off around 5:30 in the morning. And there's an interlude, there's sort of a lull right after the Union troops deploy in line of battle, and they gave these poor men a lot of time to think about what they were about to do. Sometimes it's better just to rush into things without having to think about it. Well, we have a great account left by a young officer in the 6th United States Colored Troops named John McMurray. He's going to write a book after the war called Recollections of a Colored Troop, and if you can find a copy of it, I highly recommend it. This is what he says. I know there was a big lot of thinking done by us while we stood there. We knew that there was a strong line of Confederates behind the rifle pits. We knew that as soon as we would move forward, they would open fire on us. We knew that the order to go forward would soon be given. But beyond that, what? Would it be death or wounds or capture? Would it be victory or defeat? And I'm sure everybody else that was in line is going to be thinking the same thing. Right around this time, Ben Butler himself is going to ride up to the troops and exhort them, and he's going to point at the Newmarket Heights line and say, "Your cry when you charge will be, 'Remember Fort Pillow,'" which is one of those racial atrocities I mentioned earlier. He will then wheel his horse around and go back to his headquarters, safely in the rear, because he was sort of a wanted man, referring back to what I spoke about earlier. So, at 5:30, roughly, Colonel Duncan will give the order forward, and the men will march off into the mist, knowing very little about what is in front of them. And the officers, including Colonel Duncan, are going to be mounted on horseback. So if you can imagine that, these colonels and junior officers on horseback out in front of their men as they go into this attack. So it's going to be the 4th U.S. Colored Troops and the 6th U.S. Colored Troops, which are regiments that were raised in Maryland and Pennsylvania, interestingly. They're going to be conducting this first attack. And it's right around the same time that the Texas Brigade is eating breakfast. And if you know anything about the Texas Brigade at the Battle of Antietam, you know that one of their main reasons, or the story goes that one of the main reasons that they fought so well is because they had their breakfast interrupted. Well, once again, they're going to have their breakfast interrupted. They're not going to enjoy that. And the word is going to quickly spread that these are African American troops that are coming this way. The Texans had rarely, if ever, seen black troops. They interacted with black troops during the campaign of Second Deep Bottom, but this is the first time they're really going to fight them on a big scale. And as a Texan himself recalled, the pickets who are out in advance of the main line are going to see these black troops coming at them. They're going to fire a warning shot, and then they're going to turn around and head back to the main line. And they say, as they were doing this, they screamed at the top of their lungs, "Niggers, boys, niggers," which is going to let them know these aren't just any troops that are coming their way. A Texan named Joseph Polly of the 4th Texas is going to remember the fog was so thick as to render large objects 100 feet distant, indistinguishable. All that could be seen through the dense fog enveloping us was what appeared to be a moving black wall 100 feet away. D.H. Hamilton of the Texas Brigade, who's the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Rick Perry, can't make that up, is going to recall he was there, and he said, "No man in our old brigade would have retreated from or surrendered to niggers. When they charged, the fun began." So, as I said, waving a red flag in front of a bull. That's how the Texans are going to react. And unfortunately for Duncan's men, as they make their attack, they're going to get held up in those 3 lines of obstructions that I mentioned earlier. And as they have to maneuver their way through there in the dark, stumbling over each other, those cannons on the batteries on either end of the Confederate line, which had already had this place zeroed in, are going to start lobbing artillery shells at them. and the U.S. colored troops are going to start taking extreme casualties before they've even fired a shot. They were ordered to attack at the point of the bayonet. At this point in the war, they've learned, if you stop to fire back at the enemy when you're out in an open field, that's a death sentence. That means you're going to get caught out in the open, and you're going to start reloading and firing back, and the defender always has the advantage there. So they wouldn't let the men put the percussion caps on their rifles to discourage them from firing back. So they're charging with their bayonets, trying to get through all of this stuff. So the Confederates are outnumbered, but as was always the case, especially on the Civil War battlefield, the defender had quite the advantage. And as I said, once the word spread that these were African American troops that were threatening this portion of the line, the Confederates sort of on either end are going to start funneling in. Where it may have been, one man every 6 feet or so manning the line before the battle started, once the word got out that these were black troops making the attack, everybody wanted to get in on the action. The Confederates were pretty densely packed in the trenches right there where the U.S. colored troops attacked. The picture that you see there, that's a gentleman named Christian Fleetwood. He is the senior NCO of the 4th U.S. Colored Troops, Sergeant Major, and he is going to rescue the flag of the 4th U.S. Colored Troops and rally his troops. The 4th will attack in echelon with the 6th, basically one long line of battle, and 750 men in a thin line, basically a glorified skirmish line. That's not going to cut it. And as they make their way closer to the Newmarket line, they're just ripped to shreds. The color guard, obviously, in any Civil War battlefield is going to take extreme casualties. That's the case with both of the U.S. colored regiments in Duncan's attack. What you see there is what's left of the national colors of the 4th USCT that were rescued by Fleetwood. The Maryland Historical Society has that flag. That's a picture of him after the war. He felt like he should have gotten a commission to be a lieutenant for his bravery on the field of battle. He didn't get that, but apparently he bought the uniform anyway, wearing his Medal of Honor in that photograph. The 4th and the 6th are virtually annihilated. An officer in the 6th USCT wrote, "How I came out again unhurt is a perfect wonder. We didn't dismount during the whole fight until our horses were shot. If we had succeeded in taking the rebel line, we would have been captured, every one of us. Are you astonished at our repulse? I'm not. 3 times did I push my line forward and was repulsed. I would have tried a 4th time had not the rebels come in following the repulse." That's what he's describing there, is more the Confederates coming in. We have accounts of the Texans actually throwing aside the protection of their earthworks, jumping out on top of the earthworks, firing, and in some cases actually counterattacking. They completely outflanked me on my left, so that retreat became necessary to save what was left of my command. Every man of my color guard is either killed or wounded. Fleetwood picked up the national colors, and Corporal Veal of Company D the standard. We lost 200 men, but no color, and our honor is untarnished. He described the regimental colors of the 4th USCT, saying it was perforated by 22 bullets, besides having the staff completely severed by 3 rifle balls. Things did not go well with the neighboring 6th U.S. colored troops. The gentleman that you see there, Lieutenant Nathan Edgerton and Sergeant Thomas Hawkins of the 6th, both of them are going to be recipients of the Medal of Honor. That is a photograph of the national colors of the 6th USCT, or excuse me, the regimental colors of the 6th USCT before the battle. We don't know what that flag looked like after the battle, but it was in tatters apparently. They are going to take extreme casualties to the point where they're losing so many men. The white officers are really going to take a shellacking in this battle. Many of them are killed and wounded. Command breaks down. That's when you have the NCOs, the senior NCOs like Hawkins there, like Christian Fleetwood, taking command of their individual companies, and in some cases even their own individual regiments, rallying the troops and gathering them for the retreat. Duncan, Colonel Duncan, is going to go down with 4 wounds. His successor, Colonel Ames, master of understatement, is going to look at a staff officer next to him, his mustache dripping with blood, and say, "Captain, don't you think we had better fall back? We haven't enough force to take this line, and if we remain here, we will all probably be killed." So he turns around and addresses a very small crowd of what's left of the black troops who are so bravely trying to take this line, and he'll say, "We must have more help, boys, before we try that. Fall back." Duncan's men are going to funnel back to the Kingsland Road area, and General Payne is going to get word of what happened, and you'd think he learned from his mistake. Not quite. He's going to try the same thing over again, this time with Alonzo Draper's brigade. This time, at least, it's 3 regiments instead of 2, and they were more full-strength regiments. The 5th, 36th, and 38th USCT. The 38th is a Virginia unit. And they are going to go in about 2 hours after the battle kicks off, around 7:30 in the morning. He's, as you can see from the map here, he's not going to attack in long line of battle. When you're in a long line of battle, it's stretched out. You don't have a lot of punching power. So even if you make an initial breakthrough, there's nobody there to follow it up. Draper will attack 10 ranks deep in column, and this is what will decide the battle. Now keep in mind, the Battle of Fort Harrison is already taking place around the same time. Fort Harrison is going to be to my right, farther down the New Market Road. So the Confederate line there is being threatened, and the Confederates who are manning the New Market line are going to get the word that Fort Harrison is being threatened, and they need to start making their way that way. Problem is, they're in the middle of a battle, and disengaging right in the middle of a battle is an extremely difficult thing to pull off. So while they're under orders to start funneling back towards Fort Harrison, Fort Gilmer, that area, Draper will make his attack. He's going to cross right over the same ground that Duncan had traversed earlier. So he's going to run into the same obstructions, and this time the sun is up, the fog has burned off, and he can see plainly the casualties strewn all around the battlefield from Duncan's initial attack. As they went in, wounded men on the field of battle would grab them, tug on their pant legs, saying, "Don't go in there. You're all going to get killed." Nonetheless, they forged on. There we go. The lead regiment is the 5th U.S. Colored Troops, and they're a regiment organized out of Ohio. And this is a photo montage of some of the officers of the 5th USCT. That's a photograph of them down there at the bottom before they marched off to war, and a photograph of their flag. The gentleman that you see on the far right is Milton Holland, another NCO, half black, half white. His father was white, his mother was a slave. You do the math. So when most people look at that photograph, they're not thinking this is an African-American soldier, but tiniest drop of African-American blood is going to make you colored back then. Interestingly enough, his father fights for the Confederacy and will get killed during the war. So he's from Texas originally, and then gets his freedom and makes his way to Ohio. He's in Cincinnati, and that's where he links up with the 5th USCT and will once again rally the troops and rescue the colors when the attack begins to break down. Draper's men will do what Duncan's men were not permitted to do. They're going to start firing back. So they move forward, they get entangled in the obstructions, and while they're doing that, sitting ducks getting shot not only by the Confederate infantry and dismounted cavalry, but also the artillery is still blazing away. They're going to return fire. Draper is going to try to get his men under order. He's going to be running up and down the line frantically telling his men to move forward. They need to get up and go rather than hunkering down by a piece of wood that's not going to save them. and firing back. I'm sure firing back at the enemy was sort of cathartic, made them feel good, made them feel like they were doing something. But in reality, there's not many Confederates in the Newmarket line that are getting killed by this fire. The casualties on the Confederate side are going to happen when Draper's men get up and get moving. So after what Draper called 30 minutes of terrible suspense, 30 minutes sitting there taking extreme casualties in the abattis and the chevaux de frise, Draper is going to get his men up and going, and they will puncture the Newmarket line. And at that point, it's every man for himself in the Confederate side, and they're going to start, that's going to encourage them to make their way towards Fort Harrison very quickly. There's going to be a brief period of desperate hand-to-hand combat, a lot of bayonet wounds, and this is when many of the men in the Hampton Legion and the Texas Brigade and Gary's men are going to be killed and wounded. And this is when they're going to discover that many of the black wounded men from Duncan's initial attack had been led behind the Confederate lines and shot. We have direct eyewitness account from a Texan in the 5th Texas, a guy named Joe Joskins. He writes in his diary that after during the lull between the two attacks, the Confederates will go out, kill the wounded, and also any prisoners that had been rounded up were taken to the back and summarily executed. So all of this is going to happen by roughly 8 o'clock in the morning. The 1st Rockbridge Artillery is going to abandon their cannon emplacement. Draper's men commenced what was called a rigorous attack. A Confederate called it that. Charles Crossland, one of Gary's Confederate troopers, recalls a soldier who jumped upon the works and swore he would have one good shot when a rifle ball took him between the eyes and he fell backward dead. He said, "We lost many men here and were driven pell-mell back." So it's not an orderly retreat, but sort of a panicked withdrawal. He says later, he said, "We ran in a panic for the line of works farther back commanded by Fort Harrison." So some of the men of the Texas Brigade are going to be able to get out, and they start moving. They're actually gone and disengaged by the time that the breakthrough happens. But Gary's men and really the 4th and 5th Texas and the 3rd Arkansas, who are farther down the line, are not going to be afforded that opportunity, and they're going to get tangled up in this hand-to-hand combat before they're finally allowed to escape. When Draper's men seize the Newmarket line, they stop and they drop exhausted after having suffered grievous casualties. And there's some of the totals there for you. Payne's division is going to lose around 1,027 men, 1 in 3. Samuel Duncan's men, 350 casualties out of 700 who made the attack. Draper loses 447, which would seem to indicate that he was involved in some pretty heavy combat there right at the end of the battle. The 6th USCT had one of the highest losses of any regiment, 57% of its strength. Company D of the 6th USCT had 3 men left standing unscathed at the end of the battle for a whopping 87% casualty rate. That's killed, wounded, and captured. So they took the heights, but at great cost. And one thing, I like to go back to this image. This image is, if you can read it there, it says "Struggle for a rebel battery" or rebel battle flag at Newmarket Heights. This is actually from a recruiting poster for U.S. colored troops in late 1864 and 1865. Some people like to say that Newmarket Heights was a trumped-up thing that nobody really cared about until the 80s and 90s, but you have it here being used as a recruitment tool during the war. Very interesting. So, all told, there's going to be 14 Medals of Honor handed out to the black troops at Newmarket Heights. 2 white officers, Lieutenant Edgerton, who you saw earlier of the 6th, and a lieutenant in the 4th U.S. Colored Troops named William Appleton. will also be awarded the Medal of Honor for this battle, which gives us a grand total of 16 Medals of Honor for one battle, which demands some attention. Here's some photographs of the Medal of Honor recipients that I didn't show you earlier. The gentleman on the left there is Powhatan Beatty. If you drive out to see the Newmarket Heights battlefield, which I hope you're encouraged to do after this talk, you'll cross over the Powhatan Beatty Bridge. Born a slave right around Richmond, gets his freedom, joins the 5th U.S. Colored Troops, and finds himself in 1864 back home, if you will, but this time in a different suit of clothes, with a different object in mind. Pretty interesting. After the war, he has a great career as a Shakespearean actor, so you can't make that up. And then the gentleman next to him there, you have Gardner, Sergeant Hawkins and Kelly and Penn. You can see most of these photographs are taken after the war, and they're all proudly wearing their Medals of Honor. Butler is incensed that only 14 get the Medal of Honor. He thinks that's an egregious slight upon his men. Butler is demanding not only more Medals of Honor for his troops, he's demanding battlefield commissions for the black troops. People like Christian Fleetwood, Milton Holland, Alexander Kelly there on the bottom right. And he wants them given full commissions. He wants them to become officers for what they did, which will not happen. Congress is going to shoot that one down. So, because of that, he's not necessarily poor. He comes up with his own medal. Why not, right? The Butler Medal, cast by Tiffany, silver. He'll pay out of his own pocket for these, and there's just around 200 that he will award to the black troops who fought at Newmarket Heights and later that day at Fort Gilmer. I wish we had time to talk about Fort Gilmer. That's a very compelling story in and of itself, but we don't. And just for fun, as Brandon mentioned, I just started a new job at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. My second day on the job, I find this in a box. That's one of 2 that I know that exist. So that was a moment for me. Yeah, so on the face it says U.S. Colored Troops, and then it says the Latin inscription is Ferro est libertas perveniet, which roughly translated means freedom will be theirs by the sword. So if you're wondering where the subtitle for my book comes from, that would be it. So what is its significance? Well, as I said, I think September 29th, 1864 will become one of the more important days in African American military history. Unfortunately, they're going to have to prove time and time and time again that they're worthy of the full benefits of citizenship and that they can conduct themselves with bravery and honor on the battlefield. This is going to last until after World War II. But it seems like America would cycle through. We'd advance and then regress. So that in 1865, you have black troops entering this very city proudly, and then a year later, different story. And then as you descend into Reconstruction and then Redemption, the story gets a lot more depressing. Spanish-American War, African-American troops serve with bravery and distinction and then get forgotten. And World War I, same thing. World War II, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, some of the first, chronologically, these are the first Medals of Honor ever given to black infantry soldiers in American history. If you've seen the movie Glory, you're probably thinking of Sergeant Carney and saying, no, wait, Carney got a Medal of Honor, but he didn't get his until 1900. These ones were issued in April of 1865. April 6th, 1865 is when the first 12 Medals of Honor are issued to African American troops. So it's an important event, in my opinion, not only for its symbolism at the time, but for how Americans remember the Civil War. The Battle of Newmarket Heights is going to be written almost out of the history books, it seems, until the 20th century. If you were a U.S. colored troop, late 1870s and 1880s, you didn't really want to go around and brag about that, especially if you lived in the South. So these men were celebrated within their own communities, but the history was sort of lost. There's only 3 books written about black contributions during the war, 2 of which are written by black veterans in the late 1880s, and then it's not until after World War II that the Sable Arm, which is sort of a pioneering study about black troops, is published. Newmarket Heights, nobody knows about that or cares about that really until Dick Summers writes Richmond Redeemed in 1981. And he describes the entire battle in detail, the fighting at Fort Harrison and the various other forts as well, in detail. And it's really not until right around the time that Glory comes out that sort of the dust is blown off of this story, and people remember that, hey, you don't have to go to Charleston, South Carolina to see where black troops served with honor and distinction in the Civil War. You just got to go a couple of miles east of Richmond, and you'll see the spot where they got 14 Medals of Honor. So even though the story was lost, in my research for my book, I did find one instance of really bad Victorian poetry written by a black veteran named Joseph Wilson. So if you're familiar with the book The Black Phalanx, one of those first books that I talked about that gives the history of the African-American military contribution to the Civil War, he's the author of that, and he lives in Richmond after the war. Gutsy guy. He publishes a poem called Newmarket Heights. And I have just part of it here, but it says, "No marble shaft or granite pile marked the spot where they fell. Their bones lay harvested from sun rot in the nation's cities of the dead. Hannibal led no braver than they through alpine snow, nor wed to freedom were Greece's phalanx more, who o'er gory clay followed Butler to Newmarket Heights that day." It is still my hope that the Newmarket Heights battlefield, which a large portion of which is owned by the county of Henrico, will be opened up as an official battlefield with a visitor center, so that you don't have to basically get an act of Congress in order to tour the battlefield. I was very fortunate to give a real-time walking tour of the battlefield on the actual anniversary, the 150th anniversary in September of 2014. It was a great experience, walking, and I really got a sense for, the fog and, everything else. We started at the crack of dawn. But it's an area that to this day is threatened by development. So write your congressman. And at that point, I'm going to be quiet. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. Otherwise, thank you much for your time and attention.